as catastrophic a fall as any artist had ever experienced, I think, in terms of their creation and their personal life.
From the moment Mick and Keith met through to U2 as a high school band in Dublin, how did our biggest music legends make the leap? Passion, talent, luck, and even scandal often came together to propel these stars from obscurity to household name. The stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. Next, we're diving into the incredible story of a truly legendary lost Beach Boys album, Smile. It was originally started back in 1966, that same watershed year when the groundbreaking Pet Sounds came out, along with a massive hit single, Good Vibrations, and for 37 years, it remained a mystery unreleased to the public. And David, we will discuss how you played a role encouraging Brian to revisit and resurrect the Smile album. Good Vibrations, I guess, emboldens Brian to, embark on Smile, and he recruits Van Dyke Parks, who's a, multi-instrumentalist, arranger, and what's interesting to me is how young these guys still are.
They're 24 and 23 when they start working together.
Right. And so this teenage symphony to God, quote unquote, that Brian Wilson calls Smile. I've read conflicting things about what this album is about conceptually. Is it about America? Is it about elements, fire, water, air? You spent a lot of time with Brian. What's the story now that this album is about?
Well, as you know, I've written an entire book about Smile, the rise, fall, and resurrection of Brian Wilson, because, Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations are the apex of his rise. And right. The Smile project on which he embarks with Van Dyke, that he ultimately shelves after about 7 months of work on it, is as catastrophic a fall as any artist had ever experienced, I think, in terms of their creation and their personal life. And so what is it they're doing? So one description is it's the story of a bicycle rider looking down upon America as he goes from Plymouth Rock to Hawaii. That's one story. Another story is that it is indeed a teenage symphony to God. Another thing is it's going to have a suite of the elements, the four basic elements: earth, air, fire, and water. So that's all somehow going to be part of this. At the same time this is happening, Brian, with the help of a great record man named David Anderle, is forming Brother Records for projects that wouldn't be right for the Beach Boys. So an album of laughter, Brian really believed in the healing power of laughter, which is why the title is called Smile. Yet when you listen to the songs, there aren't too many of them that actually would make you laugh. I mean, there's nothing about Surf's Up or Cabanescence or Wonderful that makes you laugh. They make you feel, and you're amazed by what they are, but they're not laughter. You got to go to vegetables and the wood shop when they're all knocking on various things to make sounds to get a sense of, well, this is silly, because Brian didn't mind the fact that he would be laughed at. In fact, going back to when he was a kid, from the people I spoke to, whether it's Mike Love or one of his best high school friends, Rich Sloan, or one of his roommates from after high school, Brian loved to make people laugh, even if he was the butt of the joke. He just believed deeply that there was something profound, that when you laughed, your body experienced an epiphany, if you will. So you've got all of these pieces he's trying to fit into this. You've got all these pieces he's trying to fit into this one album.
During the Pet Sounds sessions, Brian Wilson was working with the legendary Wrecking Crew, the same studio orchestra behind Phil Spector's Wall of Sound and many of the Beach Boys' recent hits. While he was creating some of the most innovative and memorable music of his career, the pressure was starting to build. Brian was under a lot of stress, even as his creativity soared. One especially striking example comes from a track called Mrs. O'Leary's Cow. It's a dramatic instrumental inspired by the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, and yes, named after the cow that was maybe unfairly blamed for starting it. Brian even jokingly bought everyone toy fire hats and envisioned the song as telling the story of the Great Fire. The drums in the song were meant to symbolize water being thrown on a raging blaze, gradually extinguishing it. But then something unsettling happened. While Brian and the wrecking crew were rehearsing that very song, a nearby warehouse actually caught fire. That coincidence really shook Brian. He began to worry that through the intensity of the music, he had somehow caused it, a moment that reflects just how much pressure he was carrying at the time. That sense of anxiety only grew as his ideas became more experimental, as reactions from his fellow Beach Boys weren't always supportive. It was a period of incredible artistic achievement, but also one of real emotional strain.
And you've got the Beach Boys returning as conquering heroes, kind of wondering, what the heck is this? Is that sort of what happens next?
Well, it depends. One of the things that's interesting about the Smile story, or anything to do with the Beach Boys, is you don't have one version versus another version. You've got about 20 different versions of the story. The version of the story that I subscribe to, if you will, is the one that I learned from David Anderle and Danny Hutton and Van Dyke Parks and Michael Vossi. Brian's inner circle, that this was an experiment, an art experiment, if you will, and that Brian wanted to do things differently. He knew he needed to do things differently. He was well aware that if you stayed in the same place, that you would be going backwards. And so how do you do something new? Well, Brian, with Good Vibrations, had shown exactly how you do something new, and it had been a giant success. So he was nervous as to how the new music would be received, but I don't think he was ready for the kind of, what the heck is this? And it threw him. Now you combine that with the record company, his father, the chemicals, a whole host of issues that were swirling around him at the time. And eventually he just, he said to me, he said, I figured I'd need a year to complete it, which makes sense, because if it took him 3 months to finish Good Vibrations, which is 3.5 minutes, how long is it going to take him to finish a 35, 40-minute album?
Right.
And what's sad, among many things that's tragic about all of this, is when one listens to what we were finally able to put out on the Good Vibrations box set, you hear music that is so staggeringly beautiful that the order doesn't matter. And so his ambition to create this new modular album was what was, in a sense, almost paralyzing him. And so under pressure from the record company, he was focused on the Heroes and Villains single, which according to some reports was going to be a double-sided single, Heroes and Villains Part 1 and Part 2, like a 7-minute single, which again, that's Brian ahead of the industry.
Totally.
Now, was that going to be commercial? Who the heck knows? But he just did not want to repeat himself. And when the Beach Boys Smile Sessions box set came out in 2011, and you heard all of these pieces, you could understand even more. Well, this is all great. Every little piece is great. How are you going to put it together? He needed time to figure it out. And he just didn't get the time. Now, did all of these pressures cause him to take more and more drugs? Who the heck knows? Again, do we have a forensic psychologist to go back and figure all this stuff out? We don't. But ultimately, after recording all of this beautiful music, including a performance of Surf's Up for a Leonard Bernstein special.
Despite all these reasons, Brian was still thought to be a genius. On 1967 television special hosted by Leonard Bernstein, composer and conductor of the New York Philharmonic, commented that Brian's music was an important contribution to American popular music of the 20th century, and Brian appeared on the show playing the piano. Bernstein cited, quote, "The lyrics' oblique allusions and way out metaphors are starting to sound like real poems. For those of you too young to remember the 1960s, it was quite something for a, quote, member of the establishment to pay tribute to young people's rock music."
So Brian is at the absolute top of the world as far as the outside world knows. The publicity for Smile, because Derek Taylor, the former Beatles publicist, is really, fanning the flames, so to speak. Everybody's waiting for this album. And then Brian shelves it.
Ultimately, Smile is abandoned. There are so many factors at play based on reading your book of why the project is ended. His increasing use of drugs, especially LSD for purposes of mind expansion, which he directly thought would expand the music. Capitol Records' reaction that this was not marketable and too far astray from the Beach Boys' surfer hits. His own bandmates' reaction at complex lyrics and compositions. Brian's internalized pressure and sagging confidence as this feedback was given to him. And perhaps the final blow, while recording Smile, the Beatles beat him to the punch in his mind with Sgt. Pepper containing Strawberry Fields and other complex studio music. And yet, he himself was still delayed in the studio trying to finish Smile.
I mean, he was really obviously disappointed when he heard Strawberry Fields Forever with the Beatles having put out Sgt. Pepper's. He thought, oh my God, they've beat me to the punch. And that probably was another kind of hit to the gut a little bit.
It was, but, maybe, as Michael Vossi said, the boundaries that had allowed him to separate everything had burst. And it was all affecting him at the same time. The question that I ask is if the Beatles could go from "I Want to Hold Your Hand" to Strawberry Fields in 3 years, why couldn't Brian go from Surfing USA to Surf's Up in 3 years? And I think that's, maybe he was heartbroken when he heard Strawberry Fields, in that he knew that not only had the Beatles done something that was dramatically different, but that he may not get the chance to do what he was dreaming of doing.
And do you think, I mean, I find it interesting that the Beatles kind of went on that LSD, psychedelic, changing lyrics, expansion of the mind, the music. Brian sort of begins it with Pet Sounds, which you've quite eloquently said Paul McCartney cited as a major influence. And, you have the derailment of Smile. It means that they did not have, he knew where the puck was going, as Wayne Gretzky would say, but they ended up not having an offering as that era emerges. And yet he sparked it all. And I just find it incredible that they didn't have the got derailed, it got abandoned. Is it that the Beatles were a united front? And of course, he's battling his brothers and Mike Love to stick with the formula as they want. And he doesn't have that united front to do that 3.5-year evolution that you said the Beatles did.
I think the Beatles were certainly a united front. The Beatles also had Jeff Emmerich in the booth and George Martin in the booth. So they were just in the studio, not just, but they only had to worry about writing and recording. They didn't have to worry about, everything that Brian was dealing with.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Brian is the composer, arranger, and producer. He's producing the backing tracks, and he's producing the vocal sessions. He's arranging the vocal sessions. So it's an enormous responsibility. I remember talking to George Martin about this, and he was stunned when he found out that Brian also was the high falsetto on the records. He says, one person has that much talent. That's not fair. I mean, it's so Brian is doing it all. In terms of how the group is responding to it, again, it's hard to know exactly. We didn't have any iPhones back then. There's no footage of them in the studio during Smile. You can listen to the sessions and you hear a guy in control and in charge of the recording sessions. You see a guy who's producing music videos, like in the firehouse and all sorts of fun stuff. So he's doing it, but is there grumbling going on? Is his father saying, what is this? Father's still the publisher, even though he's been fired as the manager.
Yeah.
He's adding negativity. The record company, as Brian said, said, we'd like something more commercial. And Brian's response was basically, well, see you later. He was heading in this direction. He was heading in the direction that the world of music was heading in, and he was, in a sense, leading that way. And the Beach Boys are on the road. They're playing to their fans who want to hear their hits. They don't know that the song that Brian wrote after his first LSD trip is California Girls. They don't know that, and it doesn't matter. But he did. The fans don't know that Wouldn't It Be Nice and God Only Knows are inspired by some sort of spiritual journey that Brian is on, where he believes that God is music.
David, it really seems like Brian was on a mission to take pop music to a whole new level, something that matched that powerful belief of his that God is music. From what I understand, he felt that pop music hadn't yet reached its full potential, especially compared to the emotional and spiritual weight of hymns sung in churches. He believed pop could be just as meaningful, just as moving, but it needed to be more thoughtfully composed, more deeply orchestrated. And he was, it seemingly, determined to be the one to make that happen. Is that correct?
Well, that's a very different thing than the record company saying, hey, we need another hit, guys. What do you got?
Right.
So he is going in a direction essentially alone with his friends who are supporting him, with Van Dyke, who is really the first time he's worked with a musical peer as a lyrical collaborator. And it's just I think I cite, between Brian and I, we cite about 12 or 13 reasons why he shelved the album in the book. There's no one answer. I describe it as if you're looking through a kaleidoscope, and here it looks very clear this way, and then you turn the kaleidoscope and it looks completely different. And so none of us know exactly what was in his head when he put it on the shelf. But
was it that summary statement that I thought I read in the book where you cited all those reasons, and at the end it sort of, Brian said, they just weren't with me. I didn't think it was right for them. Like he kind of walked away, and he kind of felt the duty, to support them in their, he was like the patriarch or something of that family, or the benefactor. Like he felt like it wasn't right for them in the end, and he kind of took the blame for that. Like, it's just very sad.
Well, it's extremely sad. There was a loyalty to family that had been drummed into him by his father. And I think one of the key differences, if we're comparing the Beatles and the Beach Boys, is that the Beach Boys were a family business. And Brian recognized that. You use the word benefactor. By the time of Good Vibrations, they're all married or almost married. They all have their own big homes, starting to have kids. And suddenly, there's a lot of mouths to feed.
Yeah.
And that's what, if you're in the Beach Boys and you hear this music and you're thinking, well, how in the world are our fans going to react? Not just our record buying public, but when we go out and play this in Des Moines, Iowa, or wherever. Now, I'm looking at it from a different point of view, kind of as the elder statesman, saying, well, yeah, but everybody bought every copy of Pet Sounds that was in the stores. They bought 1 million copies of Good Vibrations. This was just the next step. And so those people would have been ready for this music, especially if we look at 67 as kind of a turning point where people are buying albums instead of singles, as a point where people are starting to use more recreational drugs. as everything about music is changing very rapidly. And Brian recognized that, and he was leading the way in that regard. And to misquote a Beach Boys lyrics, to misquote a Beach Boys lyric, he got shut down, self shut down. He did it to save the group.
As Sir George Martin, the legendary producer of the Beatles, says in David's documentary about the Smile album, we all waited in great anticipation for this great album to come out, and it never happened.